The RMS Titanic. Everyone knows about it, and it's unquestionably the most famous ship in history. Today we will talk about the RMS Titanic, and in the end I will show you two items that I own from the actual RMS Titanic. She was a British registered ship, but was actually owned by an American tycoon called John Pierpont Morgan, or JP, whose company was the controlling trust and retained ownership of the White Star Line. The White Star Line was a British shipping company which was founded in 1845 and was active until 1934. While many other shipping lines focused primarily on speed, the White Star Line branded their services by focusing more on providing comfortable passages for both upper-class travelers and immigrants. There is of course a lot of information to share about every single subject, but let's focus on our main subject, the RMS Titanic. The RMS Titanic, or Royal Mail Ship Titanic, was a British passenger liner operated by the White Star Line. She was built in Belfast, Ireland, in which was then the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The RMS Titanic was the second of three Olympic-class ocean liners. The first was the RMS Olympic, and the third was the HMHS Britannic. The Britannic was originally to be called Gigantic and was to be over 1,000 feet or 300 meters long. The history of Titanic's sister ships is of course also very interesting, but before we drift off too far, let's stay focused on one subject. Like already mentioned, the Titanic was built in Belfast, and the construction of the Titanic started on March 31st, 1909. At its peak of construction, Harland & Wolff shipyard employed approximately 14,000 men to build the enormous ships. It took over a year to fully frame the Titanic. Large steel plates were then riveted to the frame. It took more than 3 million rivets to hold the steel in place. In October 1910, the shell plating on the Titanic was complete. In the hull, the Titanic had 29 boilers containing 159 furnaces, which powered two reciprocating engines. The reciprocating engines were the largest ever built, at nearly 40 feet tall and 9 feet in diameter. When the ship was finally completed, it was the largest man-made object ever to be built. The Titanic was claimed to be virtually unsinkable due to its watertight construction. It had 15 watertight bulkheads that divided the ship into 16 compartments. The thought was that if 4 smaller compartments flooded, the boat could still float. However, the bulkheads only reached about 10 feet above the waterline, allowing water to reach from one compartment to another, thus defeating the purpose of the bulkheads. On May 1911, the Titanic was released from its dry dock, and it was time to work on the interior. It all had to be perfect. Everything on the ship was either brand new or specifically made and designed for the ship. They wanted to give the passengers the most comfortable voyage possible. On May 31st, 1911, a large crowd of nearly 100,000 people watched the Titanic glide into the water. On board included J. Pierpont Morgan, financier of the White Star Line, Lord Pirrie, chairman of Harland & Wolff, J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, and Thomas Andrews, Harland & Wolff's managing director, who oversaw the building of the Titanic. On April 2nd, 1912, the Titanic completed its sea trials and was deemed seaworthy. 8 days later, she would set sail on its maiden and last voyage. The Titanic was so modern for its time. The luxury was top-notch. Every cabin or suite had running water, a luxury few of the third-class passengers would have at home. Perhaps the most iconic of Titanic's grandeur was the first-class passenger's grand staircase. The staircase was lit with natural light through the glass dome and illuminated at night with crystal lights. In the first class, there were many new attractions, such as squash courts, a Turkish bath, a gymnasium, a barbershop, and also the first swimming pool ever on board of a ship. Even the cheaper third-class cabins were of better standard than those on other liners. So modern, so much luxury, and so much style. However, not everything was perfect. For instance, the Titanic only had 20 lifeboats on board, which would have held a capacity of 1,178 people. Meanwhile, the capacity of the Titanic was 3,320 people. On Wednesday, 10th of April, 1912, from 9:30 a.m. until 11:30 a.m., passengers were boarding the ship. Shortly after 12 noon, the RMS Titanic set sail from Southampton's White Star Dock on her maiden voyage to New York. Her commander, Captain Edward J. Captain Edward John Smith was born on the 27th of January 1850. He was a British naval officer and had lots of sea experience. He served as a master of numerous White Star Line vessels. The Titanic was officially on its way, carrying over 2,200 people, with the crew included. Her final destination would be New York, but she stopped in Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown in Ireland to pick up passengers, crew, and supplies. The trip to New York would be 7 days in total, and luckily, there was enough to do on the ship. The first class was the ultimate luxury. It included veranda cafes, a smoking room, a restaurant, a dining saloon, a reading and writing room, and of course, the things I mentioned before. As a first-class passenger, you really dined in style. The dining room was the largest ever seen on a ship, and the live orchestra played background music. The furniture and paneling was carved in fine detail in oak, mahogany, and sycamore. It wasn't really possible to be bored. You could play board games, shuffleboard, use the gym, squash courts, or chill in the pool. Games such as chess and backgammon could be played on deck. Titanic had 39 private suites located at the top of the ship. They had 2 large bedrooms, 2 walk-in wardrobes, and a bathroom. There was also a spacious living room. The price for a first-class berth would be £30, equivalent to £3,651 today. A first-class suite would be £870. That would be about £105,883 today. That's almost $130,000. Second class, that would be £12. That's £1,460 today. And a third class would be £7. That's still £852 today. Most of the second-class accommodation on Titanic consisted of cabins with bunk beds. Each cabin had either 2 or 4 beds. In total, there was room for around 550 passengers. These cabins didn't have private bathrooms, but they did have sinks and mirrors. Also, the bed linen was changed every day. They had facilities such as a spacious outdoor promenade, a smoking room, a dining room, and a library where they served coffee and tea in the afternoon. The dining room could seat almost 2,400 people at one time, and the pianist would entertain the diners. The furniture was mahogany with crimson red upholstery and provided lights to add the atmosphere. Third class was much more basic. The general room was where most passengers gathered, talked, and socialized. There was also a piano for passengers to make their own music in the evenings. There was also a male-only smoke room, which was paneled and furnished in oak with teak furniture. The dining room could seat around 470 people in 3 sittings. The food was very simple but plentiful, consisting of rice soup, biscuits, roast beef, and fruit. On most other ships, third-class passengers were expected to bring their own food, which was supposed to last for the entire journey. So, it wasn't that bad. With over 1,000 third-class passengers on board, the accommodation was basic. Cabins were shared with up to 10 people and were located at the noisy bottom of the ship, close to the engines. Single men and women were split up at the front and the back, with families in the middle. And there were only 2 baths for everyone in third class. Titanic's journey went smoothly and calmly. The passengers were enjoying their time. But on the 4th day, everything would change. On April 14, 1912, despite receiving several warnings of ice throughout the day, the Titanic was about to reach its final destination, and it wasn't going to be New York. The sea was calm, the sky was clear. You could see all the stars, but there was no moon, so vision on the water was extremely bad. That evening, the Titanic began to approach an area known to have icebergs. Captain Smith slightly alerted the ship's course to head further south. However, he maintained the ship's speed of some 22 knots. It was freezing, minus 2.2 degrees Celsius that night. Two lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were stationed in the crow's nest. Their task was made extra difficult because the ocean was unusually calm that night. If there would have been more waves, an iceberg would have been easier to spot because then there was a chance to see the waves slam into the ice. Also, the binoculars were missing, so all they had was their bare eyes. This is probably what it would have looked like. Can you see the iceberg? At 11:40 p.m., Frederick Fleet spotted an iceberg dead ahead. The bridge was notified. The order, hardest starboard, was given. Hardest starboard was a maneuver that, under the order system then in place, would turn the ship to port, or left. And then the engines reversed. The Titanic began to turn, but she was already too close to avoid a collision. The ice scraped along the starboard, or right side, of the ship, fatally damaging the ship's hull below the waterline. Within minutes of hitting the iceberg, the ship begins to take thousands of tons of seawater through the holes in its hull. Most passengers at the time were sleeping and didn't even notice anything. In just 10 minutes after striking the iceberg, water had poured and risen 14 feet in the front part of the ship. The man that designed the ship, Thomas Andrews, is on board and takes a look at the damage. He brings the captain the bad news: the ship is going to sink. The captain was told that the ship could only stay afloat for a couple of hours. The order was given to call for help over the radio. The time was now 12 a.m., so April 15th. Of course, there was a lot of confusion on the ship, and nobody really realized how bad the situation actually was. Of course, a lot happened on the ship, but I can't cover all the small details because then the video would be too long. What I'm going to do now is give you a quick timeline of some important occurrences. So at 12:05 a.m., orders were given to uncover the lifeboats and get crew ready on deck. And as we already know, there's never enough room in the lifeboats for all the passengers. There were more than 2,200 people on board, and if everything would go well, only half of them would be able to get in the lifeboats. 20 minutes later, lifeboats began being loaded with women and children first. The Carpathia, southeast of Titanic by about 58 miles, picked up the distress call and began sailing into Titanic's direction to save passengers. At 12:45 a.m., the first lifeboat was safely lowered away. Although it could carry 65 people, it left with only 28 on board. The first distress rocket was fired, and in total, 8 rockets would be fired during the sinking. 2:05 a.m., the last lifeboat left the ship. There were now over 1,500 people left on the ship. Meanwhile, the front was sinking deeper and deeper. Can you imagine the panic and confusion? Water aggressively storming into the ship with great force, sound of breaking glass, walls collapsing, things being crushed, and furniture falling down. Meanwhile, distress calls were still being sent out, and throughout the sinking, the band was actually playing music, which makes the whole scene more eerie. Lots of sad things, brave things, and fascinating things happened during this time. But like I said before, it's too much to cover in one video. Something that I have to mention are Titanic's engineers, who stayed behind to keep the electricity and pumps running, which put out distress signals minutes before the ship sank. So all this time, the front of the ship was sinking lower and lower, and all the lights were still on. The stern was rising and rising, and the Titanic's screws were completely visible above the water. Can you imagine seeing that in person? Such a huge ship, these massive screws rising above your head. Then around 2:20 a.m., the Titanic breaks. All the lights went out, and everyone is now in complete darkness. All you can hear are the people screaming and the ship breaking apart. The front half of the ship pulled the stern up, and then it suddenly fell down, creating a huge wave killing people on the decks and crushing people in the water. Also, people were killed by falling funnels as well. So the ship is now split in two main pieces. It actually broke in three pieces, but I'm really talking about the bow and the stern. So the bow was now sinking to the bottom of the ocean, and the stern would follow soon. It would rise up completely and then disappear fast under the ocean. Survivors especially described the eerie sound of her stern imploding while she was sinking to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Imagine the sound of steel being ripped apart and underwater explosions. It must have been terrifying. All these people who were still alive were now all in the water, total darkness. They would simply drown or die from hypothermia because it was freezing that night. The Carpathia arrived at the distress call's position at 4 a.m., approximately an hour and a half after the Titanic went down. For the next 4.5 hours, the ship took on the 706 survivors of the disaster from Titanic's lifeboats. But over 1,500 people lost their lives that night. Again, of course, there are a lot of things that we can still discuss at this moment, but we have to speed up a little bit because otherwise the video would be too long. So we aren't going to talk about what happened above the water after the disaster, but we will focus on what happened under the water. So when the Titanic broke, it took only 5 to 10 minutes to reach the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Efforts to locate and salvage the Titanic began almost immediately after it sank. But technical limitations, as well as the sheer vastness of the North Atlantic search area, made it extremely difficult. Until 73 years later, in 1985, the wreck of Titanic was finally discovered by Robert Ballard, a deep-sea explorer with a dream to find the Titanic. He was actually asked by the US Navy to find and photograph 2 sunken submarines on a secret mission. But while he was looking for the submarines, he realized a very crucial piece of information. When a vessel sinks, the wreckage is carried by undersea currents. This leaves a trail of debris, just like the trail of a comet. So in 1985, Ballard and his team were sent to photograph the submarines again. At this time, the US Navy gave him the time to search for the Titanic wreck afterwards. He only had 12 days to find it in an area of ocean 5 times the size of New York. He used a deep-sea vehicle called Argo. Argo had lots of cameras and was towed behind the ship. After days of searching, Ballard found the trail. He knew the currents would take the trail northwards. Ballard followed the trail and sailed right up to Titanic. Can you imagine seeing the ship appearing out of the darkness after so many years? There was a very eerie feeling, like people were staring back at them from inside the wreck. Of course, it was big news that the Titanic was finally found. She was located 13,000 feet, or let's say about 4 kilometers deep underwater. The bow and stern are 2,000 feet or 600 meters apart from each other. Throughout the years, there have been lots of expeditions to Titanic's wreck for research and, of course, to recover very important artifacts with high historical value. All the items recovered from Titanic are handled with great care and respect. Of course, we are basically talking about an underwater cemetery, but some items have to be recovered and preserved before they disappear forever. This way, we can learn much more from Titanic. All these items are officially documented, and lots of stunning artifacts are on display for everyone to see. Selling items from Titanic is illegal, but there are some exceptions. Let me show you. What I have here is a small piece of coal of the actual Titanic wreck. This piece of coal was recovered from the wreck during the 1994 Titanic Research and Recovery Expedition. It's a limited piece of history, and it's the only authentic Titanic artifact that you can legally purchase. It's beautifully displayed, and it comes with a certificate of authenticity. Can you imagine? This tiny piece of coal was resting at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean until 1994. It might be a small piece of coal, but it has huge historical value. This is a piece of Titanic history, a witness of the disaster. Everything that happened that night, this piece of coal was there. When the ship slowly flooded, it made contact with the icy salt water and went down with the ship. Okay, so these two certificates come in this nice envelope. Here you can see the flag of the White Star Line, RMS Titanic Incorporated. Let's take a look at the certificate here. So this certificate has some interesting information on it. Here it says, coal artifacts from Titanic are limited edition historical collectibles. They are the only authentic Titanic artifacts available for individual purchase. And if we turn it around, we have something that we have to read here as well, because what it's saying here is absolutely true. Of the nearly 900 crew members who kept the Titanic functioning, none worked harder than those assigned to the ship's boilers. Deep in the recesses of the ship, 29 boilers measuring over 15 feet in diameter produced the high-pressure steam needed to propel Titanic's engines and machinery. The fuel of those boilers was coal. Each day, over 650 tons of that coal had to be moved from the bunkers by the trimmers and shoveled by hand into the furnaces by the firemen. These men, known collectively as the Black Gang for their coal dust-covered bodies, were the true engine that drove Titanic from Southampton towards New York. That is absolutely true. And let's take a look at this one as well. Another certificate of authenticity. As you can see, limited edition, number 305 of 1912, authenticated by the RMS Titanic Incorporated. It's really beautifully displayed, and as you can see right here, it also comes with a beautiful remembrance coin, and here we have the actual piece of coal. It is a pretty weird feeling being able to touch something of Titanic's history. This is not all I want to show you. I have something else. I said before that the only thing you could own of Titanic's wreck would be coal, but there is an exception. What I have here is an actual piece of Titanic wreck wood. So let me explain you where this piece of wood comes from. The cable ship Minia was the second of 4 ships chartered by the White Star Line to search for bodies after the Titanic disaster. We aren't getting into all the small details, but she left Halifax on Monday, April 22, 1912, and arrived in the search area the following Friday. Bad weather hampered the search, and only 17 bodies were eventually recovered after a week of searching. Of course, after a disaster like that, there was a lot of stuff floating in the water, especially a lot of wood. On board of the ship Minia was carpenter William J. Parker, who also took wreckage, or flotsam, from the sea. Of course, as a carpenter, all this wood was perfect for making things. Much of Titanic's wreck wood he famously fashioned into useful items such as furniture, picture frames, and boxes. Some he kept, while others he gave away as gifts. Parker made this liquor cabinet from the actual wheelhouse door and other types of salvaged wood, like oak and pine. He gave it to Minia's chief officer, James Adams. It passed down to Adams' grandson, Gerald Mullen, who kept it in the family until 1998, when it entered the collection of Titanic's Concept Incorporated. This well-documented cabinet has been displayed at the Orlando, Florida Titanic Museum, and then later at the Titanic Museum in Branson, Missouri. This plank right here was a shelf inside that cabinet. It was removed and offered as an individual piece in 2005. It is authentic yellow pine wood from the Titanic, indicating it's most likely from the deck, presumably ejected at the breaking point just before the final plunge. It has been exhibited to the public at the Ronald Reagan National Library in Simi Valley, California, and the National Geographic Museum in Washington, D.C. This little piece of wreckwood comes from this redwood-stained shelf. Everything is true, everything is well documented, and this is 100% a piece of Titanic's wreckwood. So I bought this from a well-known person called Kevin Sausher, a very big name when it comes to real Titanic artifacts. He owns this piece of wood. I had personal contact with him, and he specifically asked me how I wanted this little piece cut. I preferred it to be cut vertically because that makes a nice display. It comes with a certificate of authenticity, some copies of letters with very interesting information about the recovery, a news article, and more. Actually, I have another small piece of wreckwood right here, beautifully displayed on a little card, showing the Titanic breaking. So again, this wood was recovered from the water in 1912, shortly after the disaster. So it wasn't taken from the wreck after it was discovered. So that's why this tiny piece of wood is an exception. 100% original Titanic wreckwood from the moment she broke apart. Again, a very small piece, but the story and history behind it is enormous. I'm proud I own these historical artifacts. I will handle them with respect and give them a beautiful place on the wall, because the Titanic disaster is something we will never forget. And every time I see these artifacts, they remind me of this horrible night. We will always remember April 15, 1912.